The world watched a geopolitical earthquake. The footage of Nicolas Maduro being escorted onto a Gulfstream jet by U.S. Marshals in Caracas wasn't just the end of a dictatorship, it was the closing of a crime scene. But while the news networks are focusing on the Delta Force operators and the diplomatic back channels, they are missing the story that actually matters to your portfolio. They are missing the math. Because regimes don't fall just because they are evil. History is full of evil men who died in their sleep of old age. Regimes fall when the check bounces. And Venezuela is the ultimate case study in what happens when a nation violates the laws of financial physics so egregiously that the economy itself becomes the revolution. We are going to perform a forensic audit of this collapse. We aren't looking at the politics, we are looking at the balance sheet. We are going to trace the destruction of $300 billion of equity, the vaporization of a currency, and the mechanism that turned the wealthiest nation in South America into a hollowed-out shell. And most importantly, we are going to ask the uncomfortable question that hangs over Washington, D.C. right now. If a country with the largest oil reserves on Earth can go bankrupt, what makes us think the country with the largest printing press is immune? To understand the wreckage we see in 2026, we have to go back to the moment the poison was administered. It wasn't 2013, and it wasn't 1,999. It was the 1,970 seconds. Venezuela was suffering from a condition economists call the Dutch disease, but a more accurate term for Wall Street investors would be resource curse. When you discover a massive amount of a single commodity, in this case, oil, your currency strengthens aggressively. This sounds good, but it is a death sentence for everything else you do. Because the bolivar became so strong, it became cheaper for Venezuela to import everything than to produce anything. The agriculture sector died. The manufacturing sector rusted. The country transformed into a specialized machine that did one thing: pump oil to buy imported champagne. This created a structural fragility that Hugo Chavez and later Maduro didn't create, but they weaponized. When they took power, they didn't just spend the oil wealth. They began a systematic war on the concept of capital. And this is where the lesson for U.S. markets begins. It started with expropriation. The government seized farmland, factories, and supermarkets, handing them over to people who knew how to chant slogans but didn't know how to manage a supply chain. Production collapsed. But the fatal error, the move that guaranteed the hyperinflation we saw, was the attack on the price mechanism itself. In economics, price is information. It tells you what is scarce and what is abundant. The Venezuelan government passed the law of fair prices, effectively making it illegal to make a profit. They capped the price of milk, meat, and tires below the cost of production. If it costs you $1 to bake a loaf of bread, and the government says you must sell it for 50 cents or go to jail, you don't bake bread. You close the bakery. The supply chain didn't break. It vanished. But here's the mechanism that truly looted the country, and it is a mechanism sophisticated investors need to understand. The currency arbitrage, or the CADIVI system. The government pegged the official exchange rate at 10 bolivars to the dollar, while the real street price was 1,000 to 1. If you were a friend of the regime, you could buy $1 million from the central bank for 10 million bolivars, turn around and sell those dollars on the black market for 1 billion bolivars. You could make a 10,000% return in an afternoon without producing a single widget. This was the engine of corruption. It was a wealth transfer machine that sucked the foreign reserves out of the central bank and deposited them into private accounts in Switzerland and Andorra. It wasn't socialism, it was kleptocracy disguised as monetary policy. By 2015, the oil price crashed and the music stopped. The arbitrage machine ran out of dollars to steal. This is when the fiscal dominance kicked in. The government had massive bills to pay military salaries, subsidies, debt interest, but no income. So they did what every failing empire does. They called the printing press. We have seen inflation in the U.S. We complained when eggs hit $5. In Venezuela, we witnessed the destruction of the concept of numbers. Inflation didn't hit 10% or 20%. In 2018, it hit 130,000%. There were days when prices doubled between breakfast and dinner. This is what happens when the velocity of money goes to infinity. No one wanted to hold the currency for a second. You got paid and you ran, literally ran to buy anything, a tire, a bag of rice, a gold chain. because if you held the paper for an hour, you lost 10% of your purchasing power. This hyperinflation did something worse than make people poor. It destroyed the time preference of an entire society. You cannot invest in the future when you don't know if your money will exist next week. The stock market, the credit market, the mortgage market, they all evaporated. The economy regressed to a medieval barter system, but with smartphones. Now, let's fast forward to the zombie era of 2020 to 2025, the period that set the stage for this week's collapse. The regime realized the bolivar was dead. To survive, they had to pivot. They tacitly allowed the US dollar to circulate. This created the most unequal economy in the Western Hemisphere. If you had access to dollars via remittances from relatives in Miami or illicit dealings, you lived in a bubble of luxury, shopping at bodegons filled with imported Nutella and Kirkland vitamins. If you had bolivars, you starved. But the state needed revenue. With the oil infrastructure crumbling, production fell from 3 million barrels a day to under 800,000 because they had fired all the competent engineers. Maduro turned to the shadow economy. We saw the rise of the arc of mining. They opened up the Amazon rainforest to wildcat gold mining, run by criminal syndicates and guerrilla groups. They were extracting gold, not to back a currency, but to fly it out on private jets to Turkey and the UAE to pay for loyalty. The state became a cartel. The government wasn't governing, it was laundering. So, why did it fall now? Why January 2026? Why didn't it fall 5 years ago? The answer lies in the loyalty budget. A dictatorship is expensive. You have to pay the generals more than the temptation to overthrow you. You have to pay the police, the intelligence services, the colectivos. As sanctions tightened and the oil infrastructure reached a terminal state of decay, literally rusting into the Caribbean Sea, the cash flow dried up. The gold veins were getting harder to mine. The drug seizures were increasing, the pie was shrinking, and the rats started fighting over the crumbs. The military didn't turn on Maduro because they suddenly discovered democracy. They turned on him because the checks bounced. The grim reality of the operation 3 days ago is that it was likely purchased. When the price of loyalty exceeds the ability of the state to pay, the regime collapses. It is a liquidation event. Now, we stand in the rubble. The reconstruction of Venezuela is arguably the most complex distressed asset turnaround in history. The country is in default on approximately $150 billion of sovereign debt and PDVSA bonds. These bonds are currently trading at pennies on the dollar, held by vulture funds and speculative accounts on Wall Street who are betting on a miracle. But the reconstruction faces a chicken and egg problem of biblical proportions. To pay the debt, Venezuela needs to pump oil. To pump oil, they need massive capital expenditure. We are talking $50 billion over 5 years, just to repair the pipes and refineries. But no major oil company, not Chevron, not Exxon, will deploy that kind of capital without legal certainty and a restructuring of the debt. And you can't restructure the debt without oil revenue. It is a deadlock. Furthermore, the human capital flight is the silent killer. 7 million Venezuelans left. These weren't just random people. They were the engineers, the doctors, the accountants, the oil technicians. They are driving Ubers in Madrid and washing dishes in Bogotá. Rebuilding an economy requires electricity, yes, but it requires human brains more. How do you convince a petroleum engineer living comfortably in Houston to move back to a country with no water, no power, and a destroyed currency? You can't pay him in patriotism. You have to pay him in dollars. This brings us to the monetary question, which is the most relevant point for U.S. investors. What money will Venezuela use? The bolivar is a bad joke. The petro, their attempt at a cryptocurrency, was a fraud. They are likely forced into full, official dollarization. They will become a colony of the Federal Reserve, using a currency they cannot print and cannot control. This brings stability, yes, but it removes their sovereignty. They will be at the mercy of U.S. interest rates. And this is where the story pivots to you. It is easy to look at the footage of Caracas, the empty skyscrapers, the starving children, the mountains of trash, and think, that is a third world problem. That is what happens when you have socialism. But that is a dangerous coping mechanism. The mechanism that destroyed Venezuela was fiscal dominance. It is the state spending money it doesn't have. suppressing interest rates to afford the debt and destroying the currency to cover the gap. Look at the United States in 2026. Look at the debt clock. We are currently running deficits that would make a banana republic blush. We are paying more in interest on our national debt than we spend on our entire defense budget. We are issuing new debt to pay off old debt. The Federal Reserve is trapped. If they raise rates to fight inflation, they bankrupt the Treasury. If they lower rates to save the Treasury, they unleash inflation. Venezuela had the exorbitant privilege of oil. They thought the oil would always be there to bail them out. They thought the world would always need their energy, so they could print as much money as they wanted. They were wrong. The market has a breaking point. The United States has the exorbitant privilege of the world reserve currency. We think the world will always need dollars. We think we can print trillions to fund wars, welfare, and bailouts without consequence. We think the demand for U.S. treasuries is infinite. But if you look closely at the bond markets this week, if you look at the price of gold, if you look at the rising term premium, you see the cracks. The ghost of the bolivar is haunting the U.S. dollar. No, we won't have people eating from trash cans in Manhattan next week. Our collapse, if it comes, will look different. It won't be a hyperinflationary explosion. It will be a great debasement, a slow, grinding destruction of the middle class where the stock market goes up, but your standard of living goes down. Venezuela shows us that economics is not a soft science. It is not a matter of opinion. It is a matter of arithmetic. You cannot legislate prosperity. You cannot print wealth. You can only print receipts. And when the number of receipts exceeds the amount of goods, the value of the receipt goes to zero. It doesn't matter if the receipt has a picture of Simon Bolivar or Benjamin Franklin on it. As we watch the trials of the Maduro regime begin in New York, do not just watch it as a victory of justice. Watch it as a warning. Watch it as a lesson in what happens when a nation ignores the balance sheet for too long. The road to Caracas is paved with good intentions and printed money. And right now, the U.S. highway system is looking uncomfortably similar. Rebuilding Venezuela will take a generation. It will require the biggest debt write-off in history. It will require a Marshall Plan for energy. But for the rest of us, the lesson is free. The question is, are we arrogant enough to ignore it? And hit subscribe if you want to be here for the next chapter. I'll see you in the comments. And remember, economics isn't just about money. It's about life. Thanks for watching.